Now it's the time for the keynote address by Regina Smyth. One of the maybe feature of this conference that we thought might be interesting is that it combines historians, political scientists, and to a degree anthropologists. The anthropologists are coming. We will be here tomorrow. Silvia Basha from European University in St. Petersburg. But today we started with the history part, and now proceed to political science. We're going to have 40 to 50 minutes address, and then we're going to have the Q&A session. So everybody's welcome to keep their notes and questions to Regina, and then we'll come back to them. With this is my pleasure again to introduce Regina Smyth from Indiana University. Thanks a lot for coming. That's home, and that's far, and 40 to 5 minutes. If it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be presenting some new work, actually, some new ideas. This is all work in progress, so it'll be great to discuss this with you, get some feedback and thoughts about this. It was my great pleasure to go back and read Charles Tilly's work again. Everything from his book on big structures to some of the other work on large-scale repertoire change, but also his work on ethnography. So we've been thinking a lot about rethinking the use of ethnography and rethinking the use of political biography in our studies of protest and revolution. And so it was nice to see what Tilly thought about that. So I'm a political scientist. I am a political scientist in my blood. So this will be a very different kind of talk than you just heard. I'm going to show you data that we've been collecting on 2 levels to talk about revolution. A lot of this talk is really samokritika. It's about the problems and dilemmas that we're facing in this research as we try to really understand contemporary revolution, what Mark Weisinger called urban revolutions or city revolutions, and how we can get a better understanding about why people participate in particular patterns that then produce unexpected outcomes. That is, most of my work reasons from the individual all the way up to the higher level. And often I think we miss the forest in my work, and people who work like I do miss the forest from the trees. That is that we forget to think about things that may seem very obvious to all the people standing on the square. I'll give you an example. In a recent survey of work at Euromaidan, we asked people to recall what the lessons of the Orange Revolution were for those who had participated. And between 15 and 20% talked about economic lessons. They talked about class conflict. Something we never actually consider in our analysis of this political event. So for the people who were there, it was actually as much about economics as it was about politics. And that to me is an important finding that extends also to the participation in Euromaidan. When we talk about 4 free elections, 2011, 2012 in Russia, we call it a middle class protest event. That's what our data shows, that's what lots of data shows, sort of a conceptual middle class. And yet we call it a middle class protest and then go on to say, but it was only about politics. Well, there was something about economic situation that was going on there that I think is still underexplored in this study. So what we've been doing now is my team and I, including Ira Sobolyeva, who's here in the room, have been talking about these big questions that are happening that I think speak to some of Tilly's big structural changes that we haven't quite thought about very well, right? So we're talking about why urban movements are emerging across the post-communist space, regardless of regime type. And they're spreading in very much the same ways. And I think that an explanation that says diffusion, like you observe and then you do the same thing, is not sufficient here. There's something bigger going on beyond politics that's developmental. Why do we see a global emergence of activism among those who live in sustained precarity? So this idea of precarity is coming up. It'll continue to come up. And these are folks who are really living on the edge with not much hope of getting out of that protest vote against Washington. And my anthropologist colleague recently offered to me that in many monotowns, middle-aged men living in precarity are also having similar feelings of being alienated and disappointed and are changing the way they participate in politics. And his respondents were talking about protest voting in the 2016 election. So there's something about precarity in the situation. Why is the middle class engaging in protest action? So just as President Trump was elected, myself and a million women stood on Washington to protest that election, and we were the middle class and the upper middle class. The woman next to me on the flight to go to that protest event said to me, "I'm writing my housekeeper to tell her I'm marching for her too. She's an illegal." And I thought, oh, that's a class argument, right? And so we're thinking about middle class protests, and then how does participation, and this is the question, our main focus of our research right now, how does participation in one set of protests or protest events change how people protest the next time, or change how they engage politics in the future? So not only engaging in protest, but engaging in voting and signing petitions and other types. So this is the focus of the project that I'm going to describe now. There are lots of challenges and opportunities in the world of social movement theory right now. A lot of the basis of the social movement theory really comes out of the Western experience of the 1970s and 80s. In a lot of cases, there are some exceptions, but a lot of the theory hasn't moved much past what was accomplished there. There's a lot of opportunity to exploit this with new data and new methods, but also a lot of challenges in that work. So here we have the Tillian conundrum. How do you merge structural and agency-based explanations? How do we take the big context and explain how individuals operate within it? And that's part of what we're trying to do in this project. One of the things we have the challenge of is exploring the silent dogs. So political scientists always say we need to study the dogs that don't bark, or the events that don't occur. And so we need to study cases of non-protest and compare comparisons, where you might have expected protest, but it doesn't happen. And this is entirely absent from the literature, this kind of paired comparisons. We need to expand our temporal horizons. We tend to focus only on the event of protest, only on the moment of protest, and not the period leading up to and the period after. Protest or revolutionary social movement literature tends almost to focus on one country, one case, one movement, rather than being broadly comparative, and this limits what we can conclude or what we can say. We need new data, and to expand our data, I'll talk about that a lot, and we need to modernize. We need to be using new tools, and that's what we're trying to do here. So we are, in this project, thinking very hard about how individual level choices are made in highly constrained environments. And we're thinking about critical constraints of class and economic structure, institutions, and also historical legacies. And by this I mean not only deep historical legacies, which do matter, I think, for some of these events, but immediate legacies, legacies of events that happened 5 years earlier, or 2 years earlier, or 10 years earlier, that then condition what happens next. I want to talk here a little bit about micro-macro linkages, because I'm not talking about the Weberian sort of Coleman's mode, where you have a process happening at this very high level and a process happening at the individual level, and they both come together in some outcome. I was trained at Duke University in the paradigm of rational choice, so I tend to think about theories that link the micro-macro as being either two steps from individuals to some intermediate set of organizations and then up to regime type, and needing to theorize that very rigorously, or in one step, and here in my dissertation project and my book, I talked about how voters' choices informed how parties operated and sent parties into disarray, and then impeded any sort of true the emergence of a true representative system in Russia. So the data for that book were interviews with candidates, actually. What were candidates doing to win voter support? Another example is to theorize a connection between the micro and macro. My colleague Karen Rassler has a new work coming out that talks about cross-class coalitions as being the critical explainer of revolutionary success. And so, and the linkage there is that the state has fewer ways to divide and conquer, fewer ways to attack the movement, so cross-class coalitions are always the most challenging. So the project I'm going to talk about today is in work. It's a 4-country study of revolutionary action that looks at Ukraine, Hong Kong, Russia, and Romania. And the cases we selected because of size and also degree of international interference. That is there an external hegemon that might be influencing what's going on? These case selections also control for levels of violence, which is kind of nice. And also there's this interesting connection between international interference and the level of violence that is also interesting. So let me talk a little bit about this project. This is, it's taken us 2 years to get to this point, and we're just at the stage of writing a big proposal, right, to collect all the data we'd like to take. So this is super time-consuming and labor-intensive work. What we wanted to do in the first part was demonstrate that you could actually study organizations that spawn revolutions in a different way. So we wanted to really take apart and come at the structures of social movement episodes by looking at the individual organizations, the way they come together in a loose coalition, and then the way that organizations join them who share their goals but maybe aren't protest organizations or political organizations. They might be social providers or some other kind of work. So we take this initial structure that comes right out of the social movement literature, and we said to ourselves, how can we start to think about more creatively about how to measure these things? The theory has a really lot of descriptive work on social movement organizations, but very little empirical tests of that work, and very little good measurement of some of these relationships. So there's a lot of literature on movement cycles, when movements rise, fall, and then rise again, and what happens between that. There's literature on movements in abeyance, what happens in those periods when the movement isn't active, and what kind of structures then help make it easy to restart or more difficult to restart the movement. There's this idea of spillover, where a movement's activities spill over to other organizations and then they join the group. Frame alignment, where people start to share the story, where your story or your narrative about what's happening gets shared more widely across other organizations. And finally, demobilization, which is something we almost never study empirically. Why is it that people stop showing up at a movement and a movement declines? In the theory, it's all relational. Things happen in interaction. Organizations respond to other organizations. Movements respond to other movements. So, but the problem is that the current literature has very little measurement of those relationships. They theorize them, but they don't measure them. And the concepts that social movement theorists use to talk about networks don't really map to network theory or network measures. So we wanted to see if we could use network theory to enhance or to sort of make more precise these measurements and what they mean. So, and here we have 3 critiques. And the one I'm going to start with is that these theories focus on many aspects of the movement, organization, but when they talk about movement networks, they don't distinguish between an action network that is working together to go to the streets together or sign a petition, and a communication network how people communicate to bring their frames of mind. And we would expect the networks to look different when they're engaged in different activities, and that's one way we wanted to disaggregate that. So let me just show you the data. We started collecting data on the Occupy Central umbrella revolution in Hong Kong 9 months before the events. So we wanted to look at the evolution of the social movement organization environment prior to the events. We used a pretty exhaustive search of newspaper reports that reported different kinds of actions. So they reported when groups got together to just have a sort of meeting and talk about or educate people. And then we also had when they had actually action events where they were trying to influence outcomes like press conferences, joint statements, rallies, demonstrations, pickets, petitions, and so on. Hong Kong is an interesting case that makes us have to think a little bit harder about the role of organizations, even in hybrid regimes or contemporary autocratic regimes, or however we want to label these things. There were an awful lot of organizations involved in this, and very many different kinds. So you see at the top, we have organizations from law and politics, from government, lots of business associations, culture, even religion. So all of these, and they participated, you can show that they participated differently in communication actions and in actions, and in demonstration actions. I'll show you some pictures of what this looks like. So here is, in the first 3 months of our 9-month study, here's what the communication network looked like. Our study is unique in that we always try to consider the movement and the counter-movement. So this here is, on the top, is the opposition movement. And here you have the pro-government mobilization, right? And so both of them are happening. And what's interesting here in Hong Kong is you see, in terms of communication, a lot of communication across the pro and anti-government movements. So they're two separate movements which we're describing as one because we're very interested in this crossing the regime barrier line that's happening here. If you look at the action, who's taking to the streets, who's making statements, who's being not educative but acting, you see a clearer definition between these two movements, right? So down here is the opposition movement, that's the pro-government movement. Up here is a whole bunch of small sort of NGOs or local organizations that felt they had to demonstrate their loyalty to the state once, then they did it, and then it was done, right? So you have this sort of odd counter movement, they're not really connected in there, but you see that you have sort of a dense opposition, and then this penumbra of radical organizations. What happens, here's the network at the end. So this is on the moment, this is literally the measure of the network over this 9 months on the eve of the revolution, the night before. So you see, there's an incredible pickup in the number, and this is the communication network. There's an incredible increase in the number of communications across organizations, in collaborations. There's a lot of entry in the more radical stages, right? It starts out fairly centrist and it moves out a little bit. And you still can see here a lot of sort of cross communication across the regime divide. Here's the action network. So here you have sort of a radical bunch talking to each other and no one else, right? You have very much fewer cross regime divide communications, and you have sort of a different set. One thing that's really interesting that happens over this period is you do get some coordination between the far left and the far right. So this is the Jean Kirkpatrick story, right, where the nativists and the nativists on the right, sort of the anti-immigrant people, they don't want any new Chinese in Hong Kong, right? It's okay to have people from other parts of the world, but not Chinese, new Chinese mainland citizens. they start to collaborate with the leftists in the democracy movement. So you have this unusual collaboration. So we can summarize this. I mean, the pictures are sort of too stark right now, but the density, let me just say very briefly, the density measure says, here's all the possible connections that could be made, and here are the ones that were made. And the density here across the action and communication are the same. So it's not that there aren't a lot of ties, or more ties or less ties, they're just structured differently across the two types of activities. Then we have this transitivity idea, which is the same as math. If you're friends with me, you can be friends with her kind of idea. And here you have a really different measure. So in action, you have a fairly high sort of transitivity. That is, you're only dealing with people you trust through networks that you are well established, that you know. But when you're communicating, you're talking widely across the whole space. You're talking to other people. Assertivity, these are horrible words, I really apologize. Assertivity means, are you talking to people of your same power or people of lesser power, essentially? And here you see, in communication, you have a lot of disparities in power, but in action, you have sort of everybody's talking, the strong people talk to the strong people work with the strong people. And then we have this centrality measure about the center and who governs the space. And here you see, as you would expect in communication, the centrality measure is there are more people in the center, and when they act, there are fewer people in the center, or organizations in the center. Right, so this gives us a way of talking about movements and showing that action and communication is different, and getting some handle on these ideas about how people talk about revolution. To give you some confidence that this actually means something real, the most central node in the action network for the opposition is the Hong Kong United Youth. That's sort of dominating that side of the analysis. In the second cluster on the other side, look, it's these business organizations. And one of the really interesting things is it looks like the regime actually used those business organizations to launch part of this opposition movement, right? So behind this network analysis is some really interesting stories about forging opposition. So here, with this work, what we'd like to do now is start to think about doing organizational biographies. That is, to go in and do some ethnography in these organizations and talk to them and say, who do you work with and why? Who can't you work with and why? And look at these transfer of ideas and actions across the movement. We want to look at their platforms and their frames, so we're looking at their statements on social media about what they wanted and what they did. We're looking at their membership profiles to see how big they were in terms and how strong they were in connection to membership. And we're doing these meetings with organizational leaders to see if, in fact, the network analysis captures who they thought they were close to, right, in this new network analysis. So what this gives us is a way to describe the context in which individual mobilization occurs and the different tools that these organizations are using to mobilize. So that's sort of the meso level. Let me point out two really interesting things. So we think of social movement organization as being co-evolutionary, that things move together, and this gives us a better way of the co-evolution. But I think the most important thing that comes out of this is this movement and counter-movement idea. We need to theorize counter-movement at every level. So we need to think more seriously about counter-movement, and as Irina put it so bluntly yesterday when we were talking about this, not think about it as just another description of regime or a reflection of regime, but really capture the variation of counter-movement and think about how different structures of pro-government counter-movements interact with the movement to shape it and change its direction. And that's what we're doing with this Hong Kong paper. That's the second paper out of this data, will be to try to theorize counter-movement and think a little more seriously than just saying, oh, they're all paid. They're no more all paid than they were actually at the Women's March, where my president well, not my president, the president said that the women at the Women's March in Washington were paid. There's very many parallels now between our presidents. Now I want to talk about micromobilization. So the other part of the conversation is about individual level analysis. And here we have a lot of challenges. And the first one is data, which is how do you actually get data on protesters, right? And this is the big, and every way you try to do it is a problem. So every way you try to do it introduces another problem. So we can do random samples after protest and hope we capture enough protesters in the net to be able to analyze them. And I have to tell you, this almost never works. So Graham Robinson and Sam Green are trying to do this with Euromaidan, and they just don't have a big enough sample to do anything interesting with the protest sample. You can do what we've done, which I'm going to show you in a minute, which is screen samples, which is basically a random sample where the first question is, did you protest in Euromaidan? And if you say yes, you get picked, right? So we have an oversample. It's an oversample of individuals who protested in Euromaidan. You can use this snowball sample, this idea where you ask someone if they participated and then you ask them. The problem is you have to seed it correctly, and not too many people are really thoughtful about seeding those samples. That is, they start in a place that biases the whole analysis. And then, of course, you do this wonderful work like we've already seen out of Lishka on the last marches in May, where you just go into the protests themselves and you ask people questions. That makes it hard to describe why people didn't protest, because you don't have that part of the puzzle. And also, it's really hard to make people stand on the street for more than 10 minutes. So they tend to be really short and unsatisfying kind of surveys. And so that's difficult. There is some very wonderful work by Klondermans and his team, Stecklenburg, who are doing this very wonderful sort of how to do this, how to ask people at a rally a lot of questions. I don't know if have you looked at their questionnaire. I think if you answered their questionnaire, it would take like an hour, to stand on the street and answer it. So I don't know how smart it is. So what we did in Ukraine was do this screen sample strategy that gave us 4 categories. People had participated in Euromaidan and also participated in the Orange Revolution, that is both. People who participated in Euromaidan but did not participate in the Orange Revolution, newcomers. People who participated in Orange but not Euromaidan, these are the defectors or the deactivators. And then people who participated, I lost track, but you can see them. So what we do is now we can compare all of these groups, and we have this really nice idea where you have a difference, you have a bifurcation in people who went to Orange. Some people dropped out and some people stayed in. And so what we did as a first cut on this data was to try to think about what attributes made them drop out or stay in, right? So this addresses a big problem in this literature, which is we tend to think of all groups in the social movement literature as the same. All protesters are the same and are affected by the same things. We sometimes consider different patterns of protest, who shows up a lot, who goes home early, that kind of thing. But we very rarely talk about facts like what you do at the protest, your job at the protest is really important. Your job in the social movement is important for how committed you are. How you're mobilized becomes important for how you're committed you are. And your lessons and identities that you take out of the movement are really important for how committed you are. So within a movement, you may have very different groups of people, and that's going to influence who comes out next. And here, the social movement literature is sort of behind the identity literature in assuming sort of homogeneous identities every time that people go to the street. And we wanted to relax that. So here, what are our predictions for this data? Well, Mark Geisinger told us that the legacy of the Orange Revolution was weak. But if we observed a legacy, it would be social cultural, symbolic representation. There would be a very weak movement identity, which he called as committed to democracy. And he didn't even investigate in Orange whether there was this idea of a participation identity. That is, my well-being is dependent on me being part of this group and acting. We have the backfire argument from Stepan and Chenoweth that says that people respond to violence on the streets by going out, and that people with participation identities respond more strongly than others. So if you have a participation identity and you see violence, you're more likely to go. We have lessons from protest. We have a lessons from protest theory that says what you learn, the narrative of defeat that you take from the last round, influences whether you participate the next time. And we have this famous Mirowitz and Tucker piece, which caused them a lot of trouble because the month before Euromaidan, they published a paper in the APSR or AJPS that says Ukraine will never protest again. And so they were wrong, but they weren't entirely wrong, we can show, thus making them very high. So here's what we see. There is a movement identity, so these are just straight percentages of different groups of population, but we see that people who attended both Orange and Euromaidan do have movement identities that emerge. And they're not the cultural symbolic identity that we often label, right? So there's a significant movement identity. But look, here's the puzzle. People who had a pro-democracy movement identity and went to Orange, but then some went to Euromaidan and some didn't. That is, movement identity interacts with other things to push you either toward or away from protest. That identity itself really isn't explaining the subsequent pattern of participation. This gives me a little confidence about our measures because you see that people who didn't attend either have very low identities on our scale, which is awesome, and they have very high negative stories about what happened. And most of them couldn't respond. That is, they had no idea about the meaning of the Orange Revolution for them, right? So they weren't engaged. Similarly, those who only went to Maidan, these newcomers, also hadn't thought very much about what this meant for them, right? So that's interesting. Here's the regression parameters. These are unordered, These are unordered logits for each outcome. So you can see that what pushes you towards participating in both is this movement identity and participation identity, concerns about repression and network size. Network size matters because we theorize that network size is what maintains your identity in between events. Also, political interest is always salient. What pushes you, and you can see the difference here, what pushes you towards defecting is disappointment by past protests. And this is, we measured this as the Mirowitz and Tucker disappointment. This means what you learn from the protest is all government is bad, any government you get from protest is bad, and therefore you shouldn't go out again. And actually, it does predict why some people who went to Orange stayed home. It doesn't predict all of them, but it does predict some of them. Note here, there's a negative parameter on the network size. That helps to explain what's happening. Political interest is both very high, and here's the only biographical variable. I left some of the variables out. The only biographical variable that's significant here in this analysis is highly educated university folks didn't go back to the streets. Right, so there's a different kind of identity formation, a different kind of thought process happening. The newcomers are different, right? They don't have strong identities. They have a cultural symbolic identity that pushes them towards activating. Maybe this means that Mark Beisinger is right about what causes mobilization, but not about what the legacy of that is afterwards, right? That raises a really interesting question. And again, For protesters getting out onto the street, it's your networks that are helping you get there, whatever that is. So these are sort of interesting findings that give us a little meat to these bones, and there's a lot more work to do here with this, but I can interpret them a little bit maybe more easily. Here's the baseline. This is a person with all the attributes held at their mean and no sort of, which is this one? Identity and disappointment sort of variables, right? So you see, if you went to Maidan only, disappointment made you sort of less likely, disappointment with the results of protests made you less likely to protest than a normal average person. Nationalist identity pushed you a little more, and movement identity was just a little less. So movement identity is a weird interaction here. Oh, I'm sorry, that's my dot only. Orange only, you see, you have a low baseline probability, and these factors make it even less likely that you would go back to the streets. Here you have the movement identity finding where if you are a committed Democrat, you're more likely to go to both protests, right? So there is some legacy of democracy here that is not predicted by the previous theory. Here's a really interesting finding, I think. So this analysis is by definition interactive. If you look at the effect of having a participation identity and being concerned about repression, it makes it more than 60% more, you're more than 60% more likely to go out onto the streets. So this mechanism of who responds to violence and who doesn't respond to violence by going out seems to be some interaction between the identity you bring to the situation and observing events. Okay. So this analysis has a million problems. One of them is endogeneity, like what causes what, what's the direction of causality, and we're going to do some work to tease that out. But the most interesting and perhaps the more interesting question is, where do these identities actually come from? What are the really precise meanings of these identities, and are they the same from person to person? And here's where we propose to use ethnography in a slightly different way. So rather than use ethnography to revise our survey and make it better, which is the Tilly way, which we will do because this is only a preliminary survey, so we'll go back in and do it nationally. What we're going to do is try to pick prototypic people and do political biography of them, so that we're going to use the survey results to guide our in-depth ethnographic work, so that we can target very specifically different kinds of people and get a better story about what they're doing and how they'd like to proceed and where they want to go, right? And so we have this idea to flip this sort of mixed method use of ethnography and now use it for what Tilly precisely tells us to use it for, which is process. What is the process of identity formation here? So that's sort of the next step of this. So I'll leave you with this picture, this is from Occupy Central, the umbrella revolution. You can see all the yellow umbrellas, and I don't read Chinese, but it says you will be punished for what you have done, right? So I guess that's where I'll stop. This is after the violence in there. I'll stop there and maybe questions.
Yes. Thanks a lot. Many thanks, and I think the whole lecture is it nicely scales up the questions that were posed in the first panel about the personal biographies prior and during revolutionary times, and posterior, let's say, evaluation of the participation of those people who wrote those biographies, how they evaluate the participation and everything. And I also like the idea, that organizations must be at the center, to a certain extent, at the center of the explanation, because at least in Russia we sort of tend to, especially when we're talking about the fair election movements, etc., we tend to talk about either the structural factors or sort of micro-level politicization, depoliticization stuff. And in the middle, which is, I think, we lose the idea of the organizations are behind the large processes, and they must be taken into account. Now, I think with this, we can open the floor for the questions, discussion, and etc. So please raise your hands. I think we'll collect maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then the first round, and then we'll proceed with that. Jan was the first. Yes, please introduce yourself, because supposedly we all know each other, but still it's just better to communicate if you know each other's names and maybe affiliation. Thank you.
Sure. So my name is Jan Dorgam. I'm from Bremen University in Germany. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting talk, and I think it links very well to what I'm going to present later on. I have 2 clarifying questions. First, the first one would be, you said on the Hong Kong data, I think, a measure of power. The powerful organizations were acting with each other, and that not. So I didn't really understand how did you measure that. And the second.
That's a good question, because that's bad. Go. Yeah.
Okay. The second one would be the movement identity in all these identities, but the movement identity seems to be most important in your results. So what was actually the question of the items you measured that with?
Sure.
And then as a third minor point, you already mentioned the heterogeneity problem there, and so still I wanted to say that the connection between movement identity and participation, of course, can also be a justification story that was sort of formed afterwards, so that you have people who participated in those protests and must make sense out of their participation for themselves, and therefore construct that story afterwards. If you see what I'm saying, not that they were moved by that identity in the first place, but they took it up afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Since those were 3 questions, can I answer them, because I'm going to forget?
Just as okay, let's
I'm
go on
really
by
sorry,
one.
but I'm going to forget. I already forgot. So the first one.
The power.
The power. So it's power is centrality. So it's a person with a lot of nodes running through them, or a person with only a few nodes. So that's the it's better thought of as influence, right? So that was a misstatement. So what we did to construct the movement variables here is there was an open-ended question. What was the most important thing that you personally took away from the Orange Revolution? And it was very interesting to look at the responses. So the movement identity were all the people who positively said it had a positive democratic outcome. It fixed electoral problems. It showed the power that the people can challenge them. These sort of representative interest, hardcore, it protected our political rights, these hardcore democratic values that people positively thought came out of Orange, right? So that's how we measured that. Participation identity was people who said the most important thing was a feeling that we are of the whole. There were a lot of people who had those kind of responses, but it wasn't we are of the whole Ukrainian nation. That was a different response. It was we are of the whole, the protesting group, the people who believe, right? So that's how we measured that, yeah.
And there was a panel of questions?
No, it was just one. Well, there are other questions that I can go back and bolster those with, but this measure is based on this open-ended self-reporting, right? So the bigger problem is the endogeneity, right? Is this just a sort of congratulation rationalization? So the first answer I want to give you is the theory answer, which is that the findings are really consistent with the theory. So that doesn't mean it's real, but it does give us some, that's how political scientists work. If it's consistent with the theory, we have, at least some idea to investigate further whether or not that's real. So this is what I mean by having to do some political biography and ethnography and really investigate. I think there's some case study work that needs case study on the level of individuals, right? There's some statistical work we can still do here to tease out some of these. There are other questions we can use to check robustness. There are different ways to measure some of these things we can check. But I think for me, I'm convinced that when we're talking about these identity things, we want to go back in and do almost individual case studies of this kind of stuff. And that's what I'm really interested in doing next.
Yeah, there was a question there.
I'm Natalia Misalkova from the Euro Federal University, and I'd like to clarify too. You have mentioned excluded respondents who were too young to participate in orange protests, and I'd like to know how did you count who is too young to participate? I ask, keeping in mind that there are some investigations about political culture of young and very young people, about children and political culture in Russia, for example.
So it's a really good question because we're talking about a decade apart, right? And so what we did was we asked people, there was a response that said, did you participate in the Orange Revolution? Yes, no, I was too young. And so we let people assess for themselves whether or not they were too young. And I haven't yet done, and so that's about 5% of our sample, say I was too young. I haven't yet gone in and seen what age they actually were and whether or not they're all the same age, but I think it's a really interesting part here to say how young did they think it was too young, and was it individual, like was it the same for every individual or different? I think that's really exciting and sort of interesting to think about in terms of how it fits. Yeah.
So it was only 5%. So
Only
it
5%.
It didn't affect much.
No, it didn't affect much the results. In fact, the results held up even when we put them in. I wanted to know if it was robust. Yeah, so it held up.
Any further questions? Please.
I know that was a lot.
Yeah, many thanks for your brilliant talk. So it's very impressive and it's very promising. I have so many questions, but maybe
Margarita Zawadzka
from European University.
We possibly
Yeah, that's right.
The last talk I gave, she sat in the audience going, so I'm glad she thought this one was better.
So, I was hoping something different, so I was much more supportive of your previous talk, actually. Okay, but I have so many questions, but maybe for the moment I'm going to ask. I know there are several research questions actually hidden, which are hidden inside of your huge project. So I'm just curious, how are we going to integrate, if you're going to do this, network analysis and all these interesting pictures of how these movements are organized, together with regression analysis, and did you, I don't know, somehow incorporate, let me paraphrase. How did you measure the network size variable in your regression analysis? It's a pretty much technical question, but it's not clear for me how it can be measured at the respondents level. Maybe I missed something from your presentation.
So you had the same question, yeah. So the network is totally just an organizational network, and what we would have to do to get at the individual level is to go ask them about their membership and then ask the members about their organization and match that way. So really what this is less, so yeah, this is why it's on the Critica, you asked the question, right? So the question that I'm most interested in here is how does participation in one of these large-scale revolutions change what you do next as an individual? That's the overarching question. But one of the parts, and there are like 7 dissertations in this project, right? It's a lot of, it's me and my students. And it's a lot of students, and we're all working on different countries. So some people will only write about Romania, some people will only write about Russia. So there'll be probably 4 country books, and then I'm interested in the overarching book, and then there'll be like 1 million papers, right? So it's sort of, this is a real data collection and educational enterprise. This is what it's meant to be. So I think that what we're envisioning right now is to say, to extend the data collection on the organizations going forward and see who stays active and who doesn't, and try to get a sense of which individuals stay connected to those organizations and which don't, right? So that's how we intend to, in this big NSF proposal, that's what we're proposing, right? So we want a really good picture of the organization, so when we ask the survey questions, we know exactly what to be asking.
Any other question? I mean, you had more, so.
Oh, okay, if I may. So there are no other questions so far. Another question, half suggestion. Have you considered quasi-experimental designs?
Yes, so, well, here is on the project, so yes. Yes, we are thinking about doing some focus group work that have quasi-experimental focus group designs. I have to say, and we could talk about this, I'm not a giant fan of the survey experiment. I'm just a little skeptical, and I'm not sure I know enough about the underlying model here to create a good, that's my skepticism. Like, I think we have to know a lot about how things work to create a good experiment. I'm not sure we know yet how things are working. We will have this opportunity. We just got another, this has been all tiny grants, one tiny grant on top of another to do this work. And we just got $20,000, hold on a second, $20,000 to do some experimental work in focus groups that might help us design some survey experiments on the survey, but you know, Ira can jump in. I do a lot of stuff, that's not my thing.
Yeah, and I would also add, yeah, you know something about university.
But you're too quiet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I hear myself quite well here, so I don't have any problems with it. So yeah, I've been thinking about the quasi-experimental design in contentious mobilization in general. I think we do exaggerate potential benefits, and we definitely underestimate potential risks of running some quasi-experimental design, especially for the events that happened like 3 years ago, for instance. There is a way to say, for instance, okay, I wanted to go, but something happened with my train, and I could not. So you can say that was kind of randomly assigned, maybe, but at the same time, to my knowledge, there is no way to test whether it was indeed randomly assigned, right? So no quasi-experimental. You can run field experiment. I'm a huge fan of Renee McClendon's work that she published in 2014 at the American Journal of Political Science on the LGBT rally experiment, where she indeed assigned randomly certain messages, and she tested whether these messages affected the participation rates. But that was not a quasi-experiment, it was like a real experiment, right? So I do think that there are very powerful tools, powerful statistical tools that we can use indeed, but we shall use them for like pure methodological things like pure experiment or pure survey. But combining things together and running quasi-experimental, it's like, we have to pay both costs. We have to pay costs of observational data and we pay costs of experimental data, not really gaining benefits at the equal rate. So I'm here maybe also kind of a skeptical person who believes that, methodological purity over other things.
Yeah.
But we talk more, of course, about it because, like, methodological things.
So I'm more, right now, my basic is like find the natural experiments, right? So where, you have a great one in Moscow right now, where you have a natural experiment where you have variations in populations and demolition, and you can start to look at paired matches of, like that. So I'm more interested in this sort of let's do better comparative work. Let's do a case where you would expect protests and a case where you don't expect protests and figure out what's going on. Then mess too much with these. I know it's the new buzzword, but in 2 years it won't be the new buzzword. So I'm sharpening up. Or maybe it will be, I don't know. Right? But
yeah, thanks. Let me make a roll back from the methodological and technical specificities of your project, and again ask the wider question. I think what's really puzzling is that those things, the urban activism, in terms of participation and contention against some urban policies, is happening all across the context. So in Hong Kong, in Russia, in Ukraine, regardless of regime type or economic development. And I think, well, with like being in a TV shoot or something, we can ask ourselves, what's again the role of the larger processes, like, you know, the transformation of the modern capitalism system, the globalization or whatever. So do you sort of can we also again roll back from big data you have back then and see the large processes behind those micro level mobilization and stuff?
So this is what you prompted me to really start to rethink, right? Because I haven't been thinking about this, except for this observation that, you know, you have these urban movements, a different kind of urban movement emerging in Łódź in Poland and Poznan, where you have, and in the Czech Republic, which are really quality of life kind of movements. They're micro movements about bike paths and green spaces and historic development. The same kind of micro movements you observe all the way across Russia, and that you observe in almost all, in Romania, for example, in the environmental movement. And these are happening regardless of regime type, but at the same time after transition. And so there's something bigger happening there that we're not theorizing or thinking about very carefully that I think is just fascinating. And so, yeah, I hope the Polish case will get a little bit at that because I think it's really happening there. The other really interesting thing that happens, which is in part driving this project, is that in these urban movements, these micro-urban movements, you then across East Europe, East Central Europe, at the same time see them jumping from the streets into electoral politics, right? And so they transfer the resources of protest into these elections, and they actually make a really big difference in Poland and in the Czech Republic. And so and it happens all at the same time. And there's some coordination, but there's not much. So I agree, there's something about maybe like, if I was a psychologist, I would say it's post-transition trauma, right? Which enables you to start thinking about a better life, right? Or it could be economic structural, where you can now plan for the future, right? And so you're thinking about that. Or it could be generational change, or a lot of it has to do with the narrative in East Europe of the EU is making us develop in this way that doesn't suit our culture, so now we're going to fight for our culture, which is different. So there's lots of hypotheses, but I don't have an answer.
Yeah. But it's good to start hypothesizing in advance. Comments, questions, ideas to share?
I will say, can I just say about the Russian case, because I've just rewritten the chapter on organizational foundations of 2011-2012, and you see exactly this thing that you talked about, where organizations actually play a very important role, both in mobilizing, particularly in the protest vote, but also in constraining mobilization in the way that it's framed, right? So if you think about framing as a critical component of why people go to the street, the story they tell, there's a really strong constraint that comes out of the existing opposition organizations that prevent movement spillover. And that has to do with this narrative of, we're not going to deal with economics, it's only about politics. And if you're worried about economic complaints, this isn't the protest for you, right? And so you get this sort of constrained mobilization that doesn't jump classes so much. That's interesting. On the other hand, you do get a sort of an effect of mobilization of people engaged in these micro-protests, right? So that's a pathway towards a spillover effect, partially, but it doesn't come that way from economic action.
Yeah.
It's not a question, but maybe some,
Sure.
some idea that we might discuss or you might be clarified. I'm thinking about, some countries like Hong Kong that are pretty small, right? Right now we're sitting in Permь and Moscow is like 2 hours in plane. And some people would say that there is something, I don't see you, there is something specific and unique about big countries like Russia, like the US, like in a way like Germany, it might be, it might be big geographically, might be big in terms of decentralization of power and federalization. And there is like no way to tie together all these local regional movements with their own agenda into a coherent narrative that